Hello, my name's Andrew, and today we're reviewing 1984, the graphic novel, a chilling dystopian sci-fi story faithfully adapted and beautifully illustrated by Fido Nesti. Last week I was at the bookstore scanning through the graphic novel section when I saw this spine that read George Orwell, 1984, and I thought, no way, because 1984 is one of the greatest sci-fi classics ever written. Honestly, I had no idea there was an illustrated version, but Fido Nesti, who's drawn comics for The New Yorker, did a fantastic job. And in some ways, it's even better than the original. Lengthwise, 1984, the graphic novel, is around 222 pages, and takes place in a totalitarian version of post-World War II Britain with themes of paranoia, depression, and manipulation throughout, made even more chilling by Nesti's stark compositions, which serve as sometimes literal red flags against the modern analogs of social media addiction, corporate greed, and mass censorship. FYI, this review is going to contain minor spoilers, so if you haven't read the original 1984, I'd highly recommend picking up a copy, although both editions are excellent, so it's really not going to hurt to read one before the other. Much like the original, the illustrated 1984 starts with a character named Winston dragging himself up the stairs of his gloomy apartment building, where he's plagued at every angle by television spouting misinformation and giant posters promising that Big Brother is watching you. From there, we're introduced to the bleak world of Oceania, which is controlled by various ministries and dictated through newspeak, a sort of propaganda language that Winston uses at work to revise news stories so that history can literally be rewritten to suit the needs of the current regime. Despite the ever-looming threat of death and torture, Winston finds himself unable to accept the status quo and soon starts committing thought crimes, drafting rebellious journal entries, venturing out to mix with the lower classes, and most dangerous of all, falling in love with a fellow comrade named Julie. Initially, Winston feels a long-repressed sense of freedom, and the pair risk meeting a member of the resistance named O'Brien. But not everything is as it seems, and soon enough Winston is captured and subjected to reconditioning so terrible that it threatens to destroy his very soul. Stylistically, 1984 is the kind of book that just begs to be illustrated, given the overbearing skyscrapers, omnipresent propaganda, and general sense of claustrophobia. But still, it must have taken some gut-wrenching work. For example, you can almost feel Fido Nesti's hand quivering through the nervous lines on faces and bodies, which are set off expertly by the sharp, uncompromising angles of walls, buildings, and mechanical apparatus. Then there's the mid-century palette of dusty grays, warmed occasionally by faint splashes of red, which feels like a diabolical blend of Fallout and 300, amping up the heavy dread and tiny moments of joy that Orson Welles mapped out in words. Frankly, it's incredible what Nesti was able to accomplish within such rigid parameters, finding clever ways to play with basic frames, and then pushing his own boundaries literally by swerving out into full-page spreads with barbed wire spewing out of Winston's typewriter. Although George Orwell's characters are diminished and obscured by the fog of Big Brother, they somehow appear more human rendered visually, with subtle expressions blown up on the page like microfilm. For one, Winston's ragged exhaustion is totally relatable to anyone who has to work long hours in front of a computer screen, or long hours period, being torn between the safety of small escapes and a deeper craving for real freedom, which is more dangerous to pursue. On the other hand, Julie is a dreamer. She provides a spark, the emotion that Winston needs to break out of his pattern. But that reckless spirit is also what makes their affair so terrifyingly fragile and causes her to break at the first hint of true suffering. Then there's O'Brien, the brilliant mad scientist who believes that the world is insane and that the only cure is to strip away the layers of human resistance one by one until the only values left are hatred, ignorance, and obedience. Ironically, O'Brien also strips himself bare in the process, demonstrating that Big Brother and authoritarian regimes in general are nothing more than a house of cards built on a shallow desire for control. Given the original published date of 1949, it's obvious that the Nazi and Stalinist regimes of World War II were prime targets for Orwell's criticism. For example, one of the earliest themes of 1984 is the omnipresence of monitoring devices, which will supposedly, in the interest of protection, end up using people's words and actions against them, in much the same way as search engines and smart devices collect user data and then weaponize it as targeted advertising. Coupled with that is the ideology of newspeak, the ultimate goal of which is to rewrite history to benefit those in power and and dumb down language itself to the point where disagreement is no longer syntactically possible, like how social media platforms can shadow ban or delete the accounts of anyone who questions the status quo. Finally, and most importantly, we get the theme of betrayal, with Big Brother sowing fear and setting up the conditions for people to throw one another under the bus in order to survive. Similar to how governments and corporations slice their constituents up into Democrat versus Republican, black versus white, and vaxxed versus unvaxxed, making us forget that we all have more in common than not. Overall, 1984, the graphic novel not only reproduces George Orwell's sci-fi classic in visual form, but raises the bar to become a work capable of standing on its own literary feet. And given the original 2020 publication date, I can't help but wonder what Orwell would have written about social distancing, lockdowns, censorship, and other mandates during the pandemic, which created billions of dollars of profit for the mega rich, the single largest transfer of wealth from the 99% to the 1% in human history. All that said, in terms of similar dystopian graphic novels, Tokyo Ghost is a high-octane cyberpunk thriller with manga influences centered around the theme of technology addiction versus natural healing. V for Vendetta is a cloak and dagger mystery set in an authoritarian version of London with an anarchist bomb-making hero, and Transmetropolitan is an urban sci-fi comic following the debaucherous, chaotic adventures of an ill-mannered newspaper journalist. Finally, if you'd like to support the channel, you can shop the referral links down below, check out the story behind my own book, 365 Comics, or subscribe for more minimalist reviews like this one. And if you have any thoughts about 1984 or about dystopian regimes in general, let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, catch you next time, peace!